Hello, this is Laura Janda, and welcome to the Slavic Cognitive Linguistics Conference. It is my great honor and privilege to give the first talk in this conference about the Russian Constructicon. And this is the first in a whole series of talks that you will have today about the Russian Constructicon. And so without further ado, I'm going to move on to my presentation. Okay, so the title is How to Build a Constructicon in 5 Years, the Russian Recipe. And in this talk, we would like to convince you that building a Constructicon is a worthwhile endeavor, and perhaps we can also inspire some people to build further Constructicons. We had a big team behind this project, and you're actually going to meet perhaps all of these people today at the conference. So I'm not going to go through further introductions, but I want to give a great shout out to everybody here and thank everybody for all of their efforts in making this project possible. Here's an overview of my talk. So first I'm going to define what a construction is, and then I'm going to define what a Constructicon is. Then I'm going to motivate why one should build a Constructicon, and then we'll talk about how we did it. And so this is something that one could use as a model for how to undertake such a project. So here's the definition of a construction. A construction is any conventionalized form-meaning pairing in a language at any level of complexity, from morpheme through lexeme, through phrase to discourse structure. So all the way, every single possible unit from very simple to very complex is a construction. And we think of a construction as the basic unit that structures language, though it is not an elementary unit. That's because in construction grammar, we don't imagine language to be sort of like a Lego set where you have little building blocks that you put together. It's much more complicated than that, but still we have basic units. And these units may be compositional or non-compositional. So they may be transparent or opaque in that sense. And of course, compositionality is to some extent on the in the eye of the beholder, since for a learner of a language, something that might seem very opaque, but that is entirely compositional to a native speaker of a language. So we don't make distinctions along that. The grammatical constructions can exist anywhere on that continuum. All meaningful units of a language are constructions, and an entire language can be described in terms of constructions. This is a claim that has been made several times by several people in construction grammar, but there haven't been many attempts to actually describe a large portion of a language in terms of construction grammar. And that is what we are going to try to do here. That's what our Constructicon is about. So that's something that's, I think, is very exciting about this project. Here is a way of summing up what was said on the previous slide, as we can use a famous quote from Adele Goldberg. It's constructions all the way down. So all units, no matter how big or how small they are all constructions. All of these turtles. Okay, so here are some more concrete examples of constructions in Russian. And so we have morphemes are constructions. For example, I have the grammatical morpheme t, which marks infinitives in Russian. We also have lexemes, which can be monomorphemic or multimorphemic. So as, for example, tanцевать, dance. We can also have various kinds of multi-word constructions, such as idioms, where all the slots are fixed, as in танцевать Adama, so start from the very beginning. Or we can also have multi-word expressions with open slots, as in VP pod MP accusative, as in Ana tancevala pod musical, which is an example of that construction. So this construction has the anchor word pod. And anchor doesn't necessarily have to be a word. It can also be a fixed element in a structure like a reduplicative pattern or a fixed word order. And the slots here are the verb phrase and the noun phrase. And we can also have larger discourse units, such as invitations or requests or academic discourse, like what we're doing right now. But the multi-word expressions with open slots are bold-faced here because our project focuses mainly on this type of construction. So more precisely, we have collected partially schematic phrases that are repeatedly used in Russian to convey meanings that range along a scale from fully transparent or compositional, if you will, to opaque. A salient feature of such constructions is the fact that their form, while it is motivated, is also to some extent arbitrary. So if I'm a learner of Russian, it's somewhat arbitrary from my perspective that this precise preposition and that the accusative case are used here. But it also makes sense within the general patterns of Russian. So we are focusing primarily on these multi-word expressions with open slots. Now, what is a Constructicon? A Constructicon is a structured inventory of constructions in a given language. There are existing Constructicons for English, German, Swedish, Japanese, and Brazilian Portuguese, but for the most part, these are fairly small endeavors. Our Constructicon for Russian is considerably larger, and that's not something to boast of just because of the size, but because when you reach a certain size, then you can actually find stable patterns that can facilitate further expansion of the construction and also typological comparisons, which is something that we'll get into in just a little bit here. So why should we do this? As you saw, it takes a big team. It also, as you will see, it takes quite a bit of time, but we should do it both for ourselves and for our students. So for linguists, having access to a large database of constructions helps us to achieve improved description of languages. As I said before, there haven't been so many attempts to actually describe a large chunk of a language in terms of construction grammar. Here is such an attempt. So in so doing, we can extend the theory of construction grammar. And by finding stable patterns that are likely to be repeated across languages, this makes our Constructicon actually cross-linguistically and typologically comparable, so it facilitates further typological linguistic work. And for language learners, learning the many thousands of constructions that are important in a language is a great challenge. So having access to such a database will help them to achieve greater language proficiency. Can also motivate, it also helps them to understand how certain word forms are motivated, because learning Russian involves learning a huge amount of morphology. And much of that is sort of like, how that works is also baked into constructions. And this can also help us to fill gaps in current language resources and pedagogy. And what do I mean by that? I mean by that we can find out a lot about language by looking in dictionaries and standard reference resources like reference grammars. But those will give us mostly words and on the one hand, and very abstract schematic patterns on the other hand. These multi-word expressions with open slots are the types of things that are less reliably and less completely represented in these standard resources. So a Constructicon is a way to sort of like fill in those gaps. So moving on to how to build a Constructicon. Here's how we collected our constructions. First, we did it in a fairly sort of like haphazard way. We collected constructions where we could find them easily. We culled them from textbooks and scholarly literature. There was some crowdsourcing involved. And then we tried gradually to move to more and more systematic means. So we undertook a corpus-based expansion where we did extraction from spoken corpora and also from recurrent collocations in the Russian national corpus. And at this point, we reached a critical mass of about 1,000 constructions when it became possible to begin to really classify constructions. And not only that, but the classification became more or less stable. And once we had a more or less stable classification, we could use that classification in a much more systematic way in order to further expand the Constructicon. And as you see, this really kind of like turbocharged our project, because after we had spent several years getting up to 1,000 construction, we were able to double the size of our Constructicon within just a few months, and a number of months. So, and then we did that by saying, okay, we have these classes of constructions. Can we find others that are synonymous now that we know that these are the kinds of constructions that we find, and can we find ones that have also similar structure, and also are there anchor words that recur? So classification was very important, as we just saw, and classification made it possible for us to also discover a hierarchical relationship among constructions. So there are smaller groupings of constructions that are relatively homogeneous. We call these families. They tend to share a meaning and also other properties. And then families tend to aggregate in clusters, where you have we have a family that is prototypical within a cluster, and then we have more peripheral types. So these are families that are linked to each other, and then clusters also are grouped into networks. So we have often a network, which is a group of clusters that share a general semantic tag. And we can think of this system as a system of like quasi-grammatical, quasi-grammaticalized items. So constructionalization as a process, it's because constructions need to be repeated and learned and conventionalized. And this conventionalization can be understood as an early stage in the process of grammaticalization. When it's complete, then we have the types of constructions that are more like morphemes. But the semantic tags that we see in these multi-word constructions are quasi-grammatical meanings that are distributed across the constructions and their partially bleached anchor words. And our classification is not something that we created out of whole cloth, but is rather inspired by a great deal of previous work, and in particularly here we point toward the work on lexical functions by Milchuk, and also the work of Aparicio. And this makes our classification also more comparable across languages. Here's some, here you get more concrete information about these semantic tags that are most important in the classification. And in this graph, you see some of the most frequent general semantic tags. I think there are over 50 tags altogether. And these numbers show how many constructions there are in our Constructicon at present for each of these tags. And later on today in other talks, you will have 3 talks about intensity, or I mean, not 3 talks, but you will have talks that cover these three tags, intensity, assessment, and attitude. So I won't talk more about those, but let's look at one of the smaller networks, which is easier to show because it's not so very complex. We'll look at the network of prohibitive constructions. First, I'm going to show you a prohibitive construction, and then we'll look at the network that it comprises. So here we have one construction 1247, the хорош plus imperfective infinitive construction, as in наверху, хорош прыгать. So this is an example of a prohibitive construction. It has an anchor, that is the хорош, and it also has a slot. This is for the imperfective infinitive. And as you see, we have definitions, we have examples, we also have a CEFR level, and we have various tags which can be searched for. So, and take a look. Let's take a look now at where this construction is in terms of family and cluster and network. So this construction 1247 is part of this family of constructions, and this family of constructions contains 4 constructions, and it's bold-faced because this is the prototypical construction in this cluster. So these are the continuative prohibitive constructions, and you see various lines. These show the relationships between the families of constructions in this cluster, and also the relationships in this other cluster. And you see there are also links between the two these two clusters of constructions. So especially continuative between the first cluster and the second cluster. And together, these two clusters form the network of prohibitive constructions. And we also observe that there are links to other groupings of constructions. So intensity, warning, threat, and request, for example. So this is just to give you a global idea of what this complex system of relationships looks like. So as I said, there were 3 elements to building Constructicon. You've got to collect them, you've got to classify them, and you also need to make them available. And it's important to create a user interface that's user-friendly for linguists, teachers, and learners, and also searchable according to important features of constructions, such as their semantics, their anchor words, and syntax. It's also important to remember that ideally our linguistic resources should be open source, and that the data should be publicly archived. And you're going to hear a lot more about this at the launch later on today, when you'll see a demonstration of the Russian Constructicon. Okay, so here are my conclusions. So we focus in the Russian Constructicon on multi-word expressions with open slots that are inadequately represented otherwise in standard resources such as dictionaries and grammars. There are thousands of such constructions that form a complex system. And once you have collected a critical mass of constructions, it is possible to see systematic patterns that facilitate more efficient collection and classification. Access to a database of grammatical constructions can address the needs of both linguists and learners, and the classification is potentially comparable across languages, facilitating future efforts in linguistic typology. Thank you very much, and I hope that this talk will inspire you also to work on Constructicons. Take care.